People assume there's always another option, but for the energy system, there isn't. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is the last line of defense. Modern fuel supply chains are designed around continuous deliveries, not months of local storage. 4,000 feet beneath the Louisiana and Texas coastlines sits the largest emergency oil reserve on Earth. It was built to store more than 700 million barrels of crude oil. Governments don't build high-pressure underground salt caverns to speculate on oil prices. They build them because they're preparing for physical failures the public rarely sees. But what exactly are they preparing for? If you want to understand the blueprints behind the systems that rule our world, subscribe for the next investigation. But for now, the evidence is hiding in plain sight. Let's begin the investigation. To understand why the reserve exists, you have to understand how energy markets fail. In a normal market, when demand rises or supply tightens, prices increase. Higher prices encourage producers to increase output. Over time, supply catches up and the market stabilizes. That works during ordinary disruptions, but it breaks down during a systemic supply shock. When production stops or critical shipping routes are disrupted, capital loses its greatest advantage. You can print money, issue emergency funding, outbid competing nations, but none of it creates a physical barrel of crude oil that isn't already there. Money is remarkably good at buying oil and terrible at creating it. If the world's oil supply is constrained, market mechanics stop behaving the way economists expect. This is why the Strategic Petroleum Reserve exists. Storing hundreds of millions of barrels of crude oil underground is expensive. The reserve ties up billions of dollars in public assets. It earns no investment return, it generates no dividend and still costs money to maintain every year. To an accountant, it looks like billions of dollars doing absolutely nothing. That's exactly the point until a crisis hits. Then the entire calculation changes. When physical supply disappears faster than production can recover, price becomes secondary. The only asset that matters is the oil you already control. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve isn't an investment. It's financial insurance against a failure the market cannot solve. To store hundreds of millions of barrels of crude oil, conventional infrastructure stops making sense. Above-ground steel tanks deteriorate and they require constant maintenance. They're visible from space. Building enough of them to hold a national emergency reserve would cost billions before a single barrel of oil ever arrived. So engineers chose a different approach. They buried the reserve 4,000 feet underground. Along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana lie enormous geological formations known as salt domes. These are not abandoned mines, they aren't natural caves. They're massive columns of rock salt that have slowly risen through surrounding rock over millions of years. To an engineer, rock salt solves two problems at once. Crude oil cannot dissolve it, and the salt forms an almost impermeable barrier, helping keep the oil contained within the engineered cavern. Then comes the part that sounds almost impossible. Under immense pressure deep underground, rock salt doesn't behave like brittle rock. It flows slowly. If tiny fractures begin to form, the surrounding salt gradually deforms and closes them over time. The storage vessel repairs itself. Engineers don't build these caverns with excavators. They create them by pumping fresh water deep underground, dissolving the salt, and removing the resulting brine. What's left behind is a cavern large enough to swallow a skyscraper. Nature spent millions of years building the pressure vessel. Engineers simply figured out how to use it. That's the irony. The most advanced emergency oil storage system on Earth depends on one of the oldest geological formations on the planet. Burying hundreds of millions of barrels of crude oil in subterranean salt caverns solves the storage problem. It creates a completely different operational challenge. Having oil underground isn't the same as having fuel at a pump. The oil doesn't just flow out on command. To get it back to the surface, engineers have to reverse the physics that put it there. Salt caverns don't rely on mechanical oil pumps sitting at the bottom. Instead, engineers use fluid displacement. To push the crude oil up, they have to pump millions of gallons of fresh water down into the cavern. Because oil is less dense than water, it floats to the top. The incoming water forces the crude upward through a central steel pipe. That creates a dangerous trade-off. Every time fresh water enters the cavern to extract oil, it dissolves more salt from the walls. Engineers carefully manage extraction rates because excessive cavern degradation can reduce the long-term integrity and usefulness of the storage cavern. Then there's the speed limit. At its designed maximum drawdown rate, the reserve can deliver about 4 million barrels a day. That sounds massive, until you compare it with global oil demand, which exceeds 100 million barrels every day. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve isn't a replacement for oil production. It's an emergency brake. And emergency brakes aren't designed to drive the car. The real question isn't whether the reserve works. It's what happens when the emergency system itself starts running out. To understand how the Strategic Petroleum Reserve fails, you have to stop looking at the oil and start looking at the hardware. The reserve was designed in the mid-1970s with a specific operational life expectancy. Engineers then built the caverns under a simple assumption. They would sit filled, untouched, under stable pressure for years at a time. They were meant for rare, catastrophic emergency releases. They were never built for continuous, routine use. Over the last several decades, that assumption broke down. Repeated drawdowns, test sales, and policy releases have forced millions of barrels of crude oil and fresh water back and forth through the same piping manifolds. Every time you cycle a salt cavern, you introduce mechanical stress. High-pressure pumps vibrate. Steel well casings expand and contract against 4,000 feet of surrounding rock. Corrosive salt brine eats through metal valves, seals, and flow meters. Worse, the caverns themselves are changing shape. Because salt deforms under pressure, an empty or partially drained cavern doesn't sit there waiting patiently to be refilled. Without the internal pressure of a full oil column pushing outward against the cavern walls, deep rock salt creeps inward faster. Then the floor rises and the ceiling drops. Over time, the total storage capacity shrinks. This alone creates a subtle, compounding failure chain. Every drawdown requires fresh water injection, which dissolves more salt walls. Every refill changes the stresses acting on the cavern. Every cycle ages surface infrastructure faster than maintenance schedules anticipated. And every routine release solves today's problem. It also consumes a little more of tomorrow's insurance. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve wasn't designed to be used every few years. It was designed to spend most of its life doing absolutely nothing. Ironically, the more often you depend on your emergency system, the less of an emergency system it becomes. The failure chain doesn't begin when the final barrel leaves the cavern. It begins the moment the backup becomes part of the everyday supply. Draining the Strategic Petroleum Reserve takes days, while refilling it takes years. That is the final, brutal paradox of subterranean energy storage. When a government decides to pull oil from salt caverns, it acts with immediate authority. But when it tries to replace that oil, it becomes just another buyer trapped in a volatile global market. To put crude oil back 4,000 feet underground, three separate realities must align simultaneously. First, economics. Refilling usually happens when market prices and government funding make large purchases economically practical. Without favorable pricing, the government risks selling oil during an emergency and replenishing it later at much higher prices. Second, crude quality. Not every barrel of crude is interchangeable. Different refineries are designed for different crude qualities, so replenishing the reserve requires careful planning about what oil is purchased and where it is stored. Finally, structural time. While caverns remain partially empty, the surrounding salt continues to deform over time, gradually reducing usable storage volume. The easy part is emptying the reserve. The difficult part is pretending you can refill it just as quickly. When the emergency ends, the true cost of an emergency isn't emptying the reserve. It's making sure it's ready for the next one. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was never built as a political miracle or a perpetual motion machine. It is a concrete physical intervention designed to buy time when time runs out. For 50 years, 4,000 feet beneath the Gulf Coast, millions of years of geology have stood between modern civilization and an energy shock. But physical systems do not care about strategic intent. Every gallon of fresh water pumped underground changes the cavern. Every valve cycled under pressure moves one step closer to replacement. And every routine release consumes a little more of the insurance meant for the next catastrophe. The true vulnerability of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was never that it couldn't hold oil. It was that we forgot what it was built for. Nature spent millions of years building the pressure vessel. The question isn't whether we can empty it. It's whether we'll have the discipline to rebuild it before we need it again. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was never built to guarantee energy security. It was built to buy time when every other option has failed. It is a finite emergency system that grows weaker every time it is asked to save us. Treat it like an unlimited supply of oil and you deplete it. Treat it like a tool for routine policy and you shorten the life of the very system designed for national emergencies. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve doesn't prevent an energy crisis. It gives a nation one final chance to survive one.